We're in historic times. There are people who are now coming up against Christians for the first time in their life because they had to pop out of Syria or Iran or Afghanistan where they never had that opportunity. And so I feel like if people would just open their eyes and ask this question we've said, what's in my path, God? What is in front of me that I can do? He will make it clear and show you it's not as hard as you might think it would be.
Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Welcome to Radical Abundance. I'm your host, Teresa Janzen, and I have with me a very special guest today as we continue talking about love. Gail Goolsby is involved with Afghan refugees. Today, we're going to talk about what it takes to love your neighbor, what that looks like in the real world, and especially with everything that's been going on in the Afghanistan context lately. So welcome, Gail. It's so great to have you on Radical Abundance.
Great. Thank you so much, Teresa. I'm excited to share what experiences we've had and just to bring some light to what's a lot of people a very strong mystery, what to do with all these new Afghan neighbors.
Yeah, people really just don't know what to do. But let's start off. Can you tell me, how did you get involved with refugees and specifically with Afghani refugees?
Okay, it's kind of goes back a little bit because I didn't really know that would be my present situation. In 2005, my husband and I moved to Kabul, Afghanistan, and I took the position as the founding principal of the International School of Kabul, the American K-12 school that was part of the USAID package to help with families who came to work and rebuild the country, a place for their kids to go to school. So we were there from 2005 to 2012, which now is looking almost like the glory years because things there were improving, everything from education to healthcare to economics. And since what's happened this last August, things have really rolled backwards. That was what I thought was my involvement with Afghans until all of the changes and the desire for many of them to leave the country because of the instability and the oppression for women and children by the Taliban regime. And so now, as they have been coming into our neighborhoods, and Wichita, Kansas, where I live, is a resettlement city. When we moved here 7 years ago, there were already probably 15 to 20 Afghan families who would come in through the SIV, Special Immigrant Visa Program, that was offered to those who had worked directly for the American government, either military or State Department. Many of them had come, not all of them immediately arriving in Wichita, but like many other people groups, when they find there are those of their like-minded, like culture, they move together. So a lot of these families have come because other Afghans have been here. And now we have about 400 more individual Afghans who've come in the last few weeks, basically from the bases as they empty out the military bases across the US. The couple that we are close to right now, we're in Virginia for 5 months. And so they've come from different places. So yeah, we started out in Afghanistan and now we're here, but we're enjoying reconnecting and sharing what we've learned about the culture with people who really want to be a good American friend.
So when you moved back to the United States after your time in Afghanistan, did you choose Wichita because this is an area that is friendly to immigrants, or did it just happen that it ended up being a resettlement community for Afghani refugees today?
I had no idea what a resettlement city was, quite frankly. I mean, we were living in St. Joseph, Missouri, all the time that we were overseas and when we returned. And that's where we raised our kids, and that's where I worked at a Christian school, and where the launching happened that we went to Afghanistan. When we came back, as you know, from living overseas yourself, there's quite a transition and a reentry time. So it was a fuzzy couple of years that we were there, waiting to know from God the next step. My husband is a pastor, and so he was offered a position at a church in Wichita with the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. That's why we came to Wichita, was for that position, and we had no idea until we began to meet people from Jordan and Iran and Congo, a lot of things that we were actually in resettlement cities. So that was just a bonus. It wasn't really the plan, but it's been great for us and a way for us to feel we're still connected with cross-cultural endeavors and kingdom work without leaving to go back overseas at any point. I'm not saying never, but that's not something I have on my radar. Of course, I didn't before either. So.
Well, I have to tell you, I had a hunch you were going to say something like that because it sounds like such a God thing. And it's just the way that I know my God works is to put things together like that. You look back and say, wow, all that time living overseas has prepared me for the context in which I find myself now, not by any design, but just other than the divine design. That's exactly how God works.
I agree. And even though I believe it was a divine design, it was not my desire. And so that really caught me off guard and made my antenna up to learn. And so there was a lot for me to learn about how to be a good American Christian overseas, and now also to bring it into this context, how we can do that. So it's a learning curve a lot of the time, but it's also great to know that people are eager to learn. So we just had a meeting yesterday for almost 3 hours with a group from various churches in the city who are working together to, meet the needs that the IRC can't meet and to help what is a housing shortage and kids in school. And they're really working hard to make sure that they show the love of Christ to people who they're coming with a Muslim background. You're born in Afghanistan, you're a Muslim. Whether or not that's something that's really deep in their heart, we don't know. But we want to be sure that we are perceived as someone who's caring, because you know how it is. If you're a Westerner, you're perceived to be a Christian, which can be problematic for those who don't really want to see on their chest as they wander around doing their day-to-day lives. So we want to be sure we're giving them an opportunity to meet a true follower of Jesus, and hopefully one they could have conversations with as the friendships go on.
Well, you are talking exactly my language. I know just what you mean. In the context in which I live, there are a lot of Westerners and white faces, really, in the midst of South Sudan. And when I came here years ago, it was always presumed that every white person was a Christian. But I think that now there's been enough interaction with a lot of foreigners who have come to South Sudan for humanitarian purposes, and some of them are definitely Christians, but some of them are definitely not. And the behavior and the things that go on reflects that. And then it's caused a lot of people really to question, and question the testimony of Christians because they thought that everyone was a Christian. And so that's a big thing. And I've noticed a change in recent years on how people perceive me. They definitely don't assume anymore that I am going to behave as they expect a Christian is going to behave. They have to get to know me first, which is fair. I think that's okay. And then I also really resonate with when you were talking about what is it like to be a good Christian living overseas as the foreigner. And so let's start there, because it's an experience that a lot of the people listening to this podcast probably have not had the opportunity to have. What was it like for you to be the foreigner in the land?
Right. The thing that I felt most curious about for myself was here we're going to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and it's against the law to share openly or to try to draw someone away from Islam. And so as a school who was staffed by, our company was a Christian company, and so we did recruit Christian teachers who make great teachers because their heart is really to serve, and they're not there for the money, which was not great for anyone, but we knew we would have to live out our testimony. And given the different culture of how women are treated, male-female relationships, even authority figures, forgiveness, all these key issues, which can come into a school day very easily, we felt secure that we were being living stones. We were trying to show a different way of living. And because there was this assumption that we were asked questions all the time. Well, does your religion teach this? Or what about this we see on TV? And so there was good conversation, even though we did not pull out a Bible. We did not try in any way to point out differences in our faith. We respected that. And we respected all. We were an international school. So our mission statement was to show respect for all people groups and religions. We want to share ideas and we want to show that, which is countercultural in many cultures like Afghanistan. There is no critical thinking. There is no questioning because that's not really, it's not allowed, it's not encouraged. Let me say that's general. We had lots of families who paid to send their girls to a co-ed, American-run school because they believed in the value of education. We met many wonderful Afghan fathers, Afghan husbands that didn't go along with some of the stereotypes. But generally in the culture and even in Islam, as we have studied it, questioning is not held to be a high value. So that was part of it, living out just by your behavior, which quite frankly is hard because I'm living on a compound with my teachers, with my husband and I working on the same place for the first time ever in our marriage. We weren't always great. I mean, it was easy to keep that same gritty conversation from the apartment to the, 2 minutes to the office, and people heard that. And sometimes we had to really check ourselves if we were behaving well. I mean, it didn't make us go down in our love for each other, but it wasn't a great model for the young single workers in our team and the Afghan workers who were all around. So it's still challenging, even if you don't think, I don't have to prepare some great evangelistic conversation. There's still a challenge about walking out very carefully what you believe.
You mean not every conversation you have with your husband is filled with that Christian brotherly love?
Oh, opposites are a great thing on a team, but sometimes when you just want to get it done, you just want that. Well, no, not every conversation was. And this was the first time without our kids, and we'd never lived overseas. I was a new principal. We took on quite a few of the top stressors if you would make a list. And so there was lots of things we had to adjust to.
Yeah, and I understand that completely. Anyone who's lived overseas, and the fact is that there's never a time really where you're off duty when you're concerned about the image that you're representing as an image bearer of Christ, because you stand out. There is no such thing as blending in with the crowd and just laying low. It can't happen.
No, and the mistakes that you make seem to be, one of the things I write about in my book was when our Dari teacher, she came to me and we've got to be very good friends. And I loved her input. I trusted her. She came one day and she said, "Dear Mrs. Goolsby, you must not wear so much red." And I thought, what? It's my favorite color. I had very conservative, long skirts, very lined up with the cultural expectation, but red. She goes, "In our culture, it is not a good color for conservative women of integrity. It's for little girls or for other women." I'm like, oh, okay, got that message. I sadly put away a couple suits and stuff, but that was, I had no idea I was communicating a message like that. You really need, people to bridge the culture for you. And so as a foreigner, as your question was, you look for those who can help you. And that translates now to understanding what these Afghan refugees need. Someone to help bridge the culture.
That is really a great key. So you experienced the fact that you needed someone to help you bridge the culture. And then you are now that person for other people who are trying to make a home in a new land. And you can truly understand the confusion and the fact that even things like what color to wear and not wear, how complex culture can be and how easily misunderstood culture can be. I'm sure that a lot of Americans feel like, well, our culture is so blended and open and things like that people wouldn't have a problem, but it's really not true. We don't recognize the nuances in our own culture because they just come naturally, but it can be very foreign and very surprising for someone who's new in the context. What is it like when people first arrive? Kind of give me when you first get involved with someone, are you on that early arrival team or what does that look like?
No, when people have come as a humanitarian parolee, which is what most of them are coming now. They have a 90-day guaranteed bridge with a resettlement agency. It could be the IRC, it could be Catholic Charities, it could be, a lot of these are private contractors who then work for the government, and they receive their funding based on how many families come into their place. So unfortunately for like what's happening in the US overall is that a lot of these agencies lost their funding because immigration was so stopped under Donald Trump. And, we just really kind of stopped the pipeline. So those agencies, like we had 3 in Wichita, we only have 1 now. So then when everything ramped up with the Afghan refugees, the agencies weren't ready. They didn't have enough staff members. They didn't have enough, because what you're doing the whole time is you're looking for housing. You kind of roll through different regular networks of those supplies and resources, and now there's not enough. And so there are Afghans living in hotels. They were on military bases for months because we kind of just shut that down for a while when we weren't taking in so many immigrants, and now we're trying to ramp it up very quickly, and the people are here. So that's not a great preparation. So that 90 days, then some can be extended they're extended in things like food stamps or different kinds of financial benefits, but they kind of stop their casework situation where they have someone to call unless you have a special need and you can have that extended. So that's not enough time for anybody. I think about mine, that first 90 days in Afghanistan, what a fog. I have no idea. And I was in a situation where we were being cared for. Our USAID grant provided for this and that. Nothing like what they're going through. So we have in Bridges, Wichita, which is the name of our group here of all the different people from churches and that are involved, we try to give a welcome basket. We try to at least introduce ourselves, because this was interesting to learn. Most of the resettlement agencies don't want their workers taking like the same family over and over again to appointments or to help them get their PO box, because they don't want them to become dependent on that American. That sounds great, right? But how do you build a relationship of trust if you see a different person every time? A different person taking your wife, your children, which in Afghanistan, because the women don't drive, that means you trust that driver with your most precious people. And so now every time they turn around, it's a different person. It could be a man, a woman. So that's where we have tried to set up an American friend that we'll check with them once a week. We're also teaching boundaries and culture with our volunteers so that they're not overwhelmed, or because your heart is full. But I don't know if you've ever heard this, but those who've worked with immigrants around the world will tell you it's a very difficult role. It's exhausting. And so, and it isn't always, people who are traumatized aren't always the most easygoing, grateful people. They're sometimes just stuck in their trauma. So that can wear you out, because you're thinking, here I am giving resources and time, and you don't get always the feedback that would make you want to stay in it. So people sometimes drop out after a short time. All that to say, we're trying to do it on both ends. Boundaries for the volunteers, training for them to understand what's going on, and also, though, to give a trusting connection to the new arrivals.
Now, speaking of the issue of trauma, what was it like for those who were already in the United States watching the news as it was unfolding and what was happening recently in Afghanistan? I'm imagining it was distressing beyond imagination.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know that. I have had a different family, a woman that I worked with as an English partner, and they got their citizenship after, I think I worked with her for almost 3 years. Never practiced her English. It was really hard. She had all these kids who spoke great English from being in school, but she just wouldn't. But she memorized every question and every answer on the citizenship test, and she passed. They couldn't have really had a conversation with her where to sit, but she passed her test. So I didn't have any connection that I heard those kind of comments. I'm with you. I could guess how difficult it was, but I will tell you this. When we returned from Afghanistan, we were permitted to open up our Facebook to Afghans, where when we were in the country, we did not, just being wise. And so since then, and because of having this book about Afghanistan, a lot of Afghan women have become Facebook friends. I don't know hardly any of them. I know the original ones who then had the friends who wanted to be friends. But I thought, well, if they want to follow my family and my way of thinking and that kind of thing, that's fine. Well, now I am bombarded daily with private messages of people wanting help, and women journalists particularly are a target. And these are people I don't know. So I can't really do anything to help them. And so that has been, of course, a surprising and unplanned for thing. So I know what's happening there a little bit from all of these messages that we get. My husband too. And we have actually been working with our workers to help them with some of the possible visas that are now opened up for those who worked for Americans, even though they are not the SIV level, the P1, the P2. So we're still connecting that way. So we have, sadly, a pretty good idea of what's happening there, but I don't know the reaction of those who are already here.
Well, I know my experience has been, I know that the need is so huge, the crisis is so wide, there is so much that's going on. And me, as one person, I don't have the ability to address the big problem. But what I can do is something one-on-one with 1, 2, or 3 people who God brings into my life for a season, short season or long season. And so while the world is going crazy around all of us, and it's easy to get distracted with those high-level big issues, when I really believe that God is calling us to those more closer relationships, the intimate ones that are really nearby, that we can do something about. And yes, it's a person by person situation from my experience. Exactly. So what does it look like for an average person now in the United States, regardless of who their neighbor is? Many cities have immigrants of various kinds who have been there a long time or a short time. How can we be a good Christian neighbor?
I think in the same way when we first arrived in Afghanistan, or you in your city, anyone who's going to be a global worker, an invited immigrant, they need language study. So a lot of what groups do first off is try to get English lessons, English classes, find English teachers. And this is great because even though there are those well-trained to work directly with the ELL population, really part of what you just need is someone who is a native English speaker, who can actually help them with their greetings, help them with their trips to the grocery store. Doesn't have to be formal training. That has its place too. And in our group here in Wichita, we have some of those who are the team leaders of that, who are recruiting lots of people. So we have classes, and we have for men, classes for women, and a lot happening in the home. Like my couple that we met, they both went to Kabul University, they're trained. And so they took English classes there. I'm not a native English speaker, but she was in the Afghan military and worked with Americans. So their English is pretty good. They need more than what is happening at some of the other locations. So I have just ordered some new materials to get to that level of intermediate to advanced, which, I mean, she knows what a possessive pronoun is. How many English language learners know that? So I know I need to try to meet them where they're at and keep helping them with their language. She's also going to be a new mom in May. And so there's a lot that I can help her with just navigating medical, visiting the hospital. She had her first visit with her doctor, which she was able to get a female. She was delighted because, of course, that's their cultural thing. So I think it is exactly what you said, Teresa. It's like, I think Jesus was so helpful to give us the Good Samaritan story, because basically the Good Samaritan didn't help every person in the ditch. He helped the person that he came across on his regular path. And I think when people say to me, oh, how do you just not get overwhelmed with compassion and all that? I said, I try to keep focused on who's in my path, who's in my windshield. I cannot do all these people. And that goes for homeless, that goes for, poverty cases, children with special needs. As a teacher, we really just have to do, if you're going to go the long haul, you've got to really measure out that compassion and resources and trust God for all of those. I was just reading the other day about when Jesus went through crowds, and he basically said there's going to be poor people everywhere all the time. He basically handled the people that God sent to him, and there were so many more. And I don't know how he lived with that pain himself, because he was obviously much more compassionate than I am, but I think that's the way to go through whatever we do. My husband's a pastor. He has that same issue with just people in the church.
I love that you talked about the issue of language, because that is obviously a huge barrier. I can testify to the fact that learning language as an adult is much harder than learning a language as a child. And the kids seem to pick things up really fast, and then the parents feel left behind and maybe even feel less than. And it is such an important part of assimilating into your new home and your new culture. And I think it's one of the barriers that oftentimes keeps refugees within their own community with people that they can share a culture and a language with. I know people who've been in the United States for many, many years, and their language skills haven't advanced a whole lot because they just keep themselves sequestered with people who will speak their native language. And it really limits the opportunities for them, and it limits our ability to love them unless we can help encourage and draw them out of that. And also what you talked about, the everyday language skills, I think is also very important. I do teach English here in South Sudan. I teach at a theological college to Bible and theology students. So it's a combination of college level English and language acquisition, because for all of my students, language is at the minimum their third language, but possibly even farther removed than that. And I find myself having conversations that my language teaching training didn't completely prepare me for, a little bit, because actually I had one of my main teachers was a missionary for many years overseas, and she did actually prepare me somewhat for having these conversations. But I've had to have conversations with students before about some words that are considered not appropriate to many. I haven't done a formal lesson on some of those words, but I have had to use those words in the context of explaining why that word you hear on television and in the movies, and though it starts with an F and goes on. Wow, that was not something I was fully prepared for.
I totally get that, and think about being in a school with teenagers. And so we had situations where there were gang fights after school out on the street. We're getting reports, and we bring them all in, because even though it's after school, they're ISK students, and hello, we're like under watch here. Everyone's watching the school. And I'll never forget, we had this boy, and he said, "I had to fight him, Mrs. Goolsby. He called my mother a terrible thing." And I'm thinking, trying to understand. And finally, I realized he was actually taking a word that's a terrible word, but it wasn't really about his mother. It was a bad word. And so here I'm sitting with my boss and some other leaders, and we're having to explain to this guy just so that, I don't know, we just had to explain to him, well, it is terrible, but he wasn't saying that about your mother. And anyway, when they left, we just burst out laughing. We thought we came to educate Afghans, but we really didn't want to educate them on some of our terrible cultural awful things. And sometimes even when we'd see them wearing, we had a lot of repatriated students whose parents left during the Russian years, came back to rebuild the country with their bilingual skills. So the kids were raised in New Jersey and California and, Virginia and Canada. And so they knew a lot about American culture. So they're bringing their sagging pants and their, all the things. And here we're like, oh, no, don't, that's not really our dress code, but we had to, navigate all that, pick your battles. And then we saw Afghan young men trying to emulate their, baseball hat on the side. We're like, no, please don't pick up this culture. We're trying not to, we don't like that. In our world, educators fight against it. But anyway, I know exactly what you mean. And that isn't it. And even I had so many conversations with dads about female issues. Yeah. I never talked like that with men so many times in my life, but the moms couldn't speak English, so they couldn't come and explain why their daughter was not able to do PE or whatever. And I remember thinking, this is so unusual. Oh, wow.
I know. We go. Things are so different in different cultures. Things that we don't talk about in the United States very openly are very openly discussed here in South Sudan. And that's interesting. And then vice versa, things that we talk about very openly in the US are not really very polite conversation here in South Sudan. So learning those nuances of the culture. And then it's also just so very, very overwhelming. I remember one time in the United States, I took a student, she wanted to buy a jar of mayonnaise. And I took her to, I think it was a, super center of some kind. It was a grocery store. And do you know how many kinds of mayonnaise is on an American grocery store shelf?
Too many, too many.
And do you know the size of our jars? She looked at the huge jars on the shelf and she said, I just need the normal one. And to her, a normal jar was very small, but it's overwhelming. And I feel that way now when I return to the United States and try to buy a box of cereal. Wow, the choices are incredible. And not even recognizing what some of those words are and all of that is difficult.
And I think a challenge for us when we study culture, the direct versus the indirect communication, the time versus non-time orientation. And that's one of the things we talk about with our volunteers, that, we are very bells and whistles, and I'm an educator, so I live by clocks and all that kind of thing. But that is not the culture of Afghanistan. I mean, you would get an invitation to a wedding, a gold embossed invitation, like 2 or 3 days before the event. And we'd be like, oh, well, I'm already busy. I mean, it took us a while to learn. The question was, do you honor me enough to put aside to spend all day at this Afghan wedding? And so here, when we're trying to tell them, when you're going to pick up your Afghan friend for appointment, they will ask you to come in for tea, and you'll think, we got to go. I mean, so right. you understand that so that you can enter into the beauty of their hospitality and presence that we are struggling to get back with all our devices, and then just even direct or indirect communication. How I learned early on that no in Afghanistan, ask again. Well, as a principal and hundreds of kids, I just couldn't figure that out until finally, when someone would come and have this great, very complimentary introduction, but they wanted something from me and I knew that I couldn't do it, I had to say, it's not possible. Well, the first time I figured out I got to come up with another one besides no, because no wasn't working. And I said that, I remember seeing the look on the gentleman's face. It was like a fire hose had just been sprayed on him, because he was like, not possible. I'm like, finally, we're communicating here. No, you can't take your kid for 2 weeks to India at the anniversary of, the grandmother's death without missing some grades. We just can't do that. And I remember thinking, I need to try. But on the other hand, I knew when I had an appointment, I would not do things right afterwards to rush them out, because that was disrespectful to them. They made time, they came dressed up, to have this conference. So I think here we're stretched and a little bit strained to try to figure out how to, be with them, introduce them to American culture, but they have some wonderful parts of their culture that we would do well to embrace. And hopefully.
Yeah, we don't want to erase their culture at all. We just really want to help them enjoy and embrace their new environment and enjoy the benefits of both cultures. I think about, most Americans who are going to welcome refugees into their neighborhoods and as their neighbors, they're not going to have the benefit that you and I have had of training and years of cross-cultural experience and making mistakes and having time to recover from those mistakes. So I try to offer just, a little bit of advice. And what I would offer is, first of all, if someone who comes from another culture has offended you in some way, I would, first of all, assume that you don't understand what is going on, rather than assuming that they are trying to offend you. It's probably actually highly unlikely that they are trying to offend you, and it's much more likely that there is a misunderstanding somewhere. And I learned that in my first year in South Sudan, because I was easily offended by, most of the languages in South Sudan, they speak everything in the imperative, and so they tell you to do everything. Sit down, do this, move here, go here. And there is no word please in many of the languages. And so all the time people are bossy, and I was offended. And then when I learned, that this is just part of their language structure. And therefore, when someone just tells you to do something, it's okay to say no, or that's not what I want to do. That's totally fine. They're actually asking, but their language doesn't account for that. Um, so I learned, if I'm offended, assume that there's a misunderstanding somewhere and don't be offended. That's my piece of advice. Do you have something you would share with people when they're interacting with their new neighbors?
One of the things I think we need to do, especially with English language learners, which is not always an American habit, is to speak slowly and to look at them in the eyes so that they can try to pick up not just your words, but the nuances of, communication and language that comes through the nonverbal. I think that asking them, just really, this is good listening. You and I would know this. When you've given someone information and you're not sure, ask if they understood, ask if they have questions. Just try to not just some information and think it's all taken in and why didn't they do what I said? Because sometimes it didn't register. They may nod politely, but it doesn't mean they took in all the information. And so it's always good to check and say, so do you know what I mean? Or do you? And sometimes they'll say, they'll repeat back, and it's helpful that way.
And it's not easy to say, I don't understand for some people. And in some cultures, that is very, very hard to say, I don't understand. Yeah. I have a friend who was one of the South Sudanese Lost Boys. And when he came to the United States, he had 3 months to get a job, and he got a job in a warehouse filling mail order things. And he shared with me the story. He'd get a piece of paper that had the description of the product on it, and he had to go and find it in the warehouse and put it in the box. And he would be gone for a very long time trying to find the product. And he told me the one that really caused him a lot of trouble, someone had ordered a Paisley baby bumper. Now, if you are not a native English speaker and you have a piece of paper that says Paisley baby bumper, what is that? He was gone for so long trying to locate what this product was, he almost lost his job. And then he finally had to confess, I just don't understand. But it was not easy for him.
The more that we listen, the more that we just engage and give time, I think, especially as believers, we know that God can come in and increase what seems to be such a misunderstanding, but can increase our understanding and can increase their grace. And it's really just a step-by-step process.
Absolutely. Well, Gail, you did mention earlier about the book that you have called Unveiled Truth. Can you tell us a little bit more about that book?
Thank you. When I came back in that 2-year wandering transition, that nowhere between two somewheres, I just kind of was waiting for my husband to figure out what to do. He really still wanted to be in Afghanistan, but I was released from my job. And so I was not going back. And we were having grandchildren. And so anyway, I just began to put some things down. I never wanted to write a book. People said, oh, did you always want to? I'm like, no, I don't burn to write, but I have writing skills. I'm an educator. I've had lots of opportunity to write in a couple master's degrees. Anyway, I began to write down just different things that came to my mind because I kept hearing the stories that I was telling over again. And people would say, oh, you should write that down. So I had a friend in my church, and she was an English teacher and had written a couple of books for some companies. And so I said, will you just look at this, see if I even make sense of the grammar. So that's the only person that I had kind of involved. And I kind of finished it when the school was closing. And somehow when that was happening, I thought, oh my goodness, it's like this never happened. If we don't have the story written down, it's like it never happened. And so then after that, I didn't know what to do. I had a friend who said, come to a Christian writers conference in Kansas City because we were close. Anyway, I began this journey into the mysterious world of writing. And I'll have to say, I didn't like it. I didn't feel like thrilled by it, but I'm a finisher. So this project has started, and we got to finish it. And so step by step, each time I got to a place going, what next? Something would come into my view. And one of them was one of your guests you had, Kathy Carlton Willis. She was speaking at a Christian Writers Conference in Tulsa. My kids were there. I went to that just to get another thing. And she helped me along she helped with the book, how to write, get an agent and all these things. And so we did that for a couple of years, and I got great little emails from publishers saying, great story, good writing, unknown author. You know how it is. And today's publishing need to have, a lot of following and all that. And so I didn't know what to do with that. And that kind of ended that time. And we moved to Wichita. And so it's still sitting there, not finished. And I'm feeling that thing, but now I'm a life coach. Now I'm moving into different things that I'm doing. And I'm just kind of like, well, whatever, God. One day, another divine appointment, I'm meeting with my business group just to help my life coaching business. And the window washer man says, you should meet with my wife and talk books. And I said, who's your wife? And he told me her name. And I said, well, what does she do? She writes for Bethany House. She's a Christian fiction, historical, whatever. I went, really? And he goes, and she's really decided to kind of take on the publishing herself. She doesn't like them telling you what cover you have, and kind of gave me some insights to the publishing world from that side of it. And so we met, and she is awesome. But let me tell you, our first meeting, she basically said, I read 3 chapters of your book, and I can tell you why nobody wants it. Oh, okay. Okay. Happy to meet you too. Anyway, I said, okay. She said, you're in between genres. You're not really a memoir. You're kind of like, it's like you're trying to teach something. And I said, well, yeah, because I'm a teacher. I'm an educator. She said, well, why didn't you write your book that way? I said, because I don't know how to do that. And she said, well, I can help you, but it's going to be painful. So I said, okay. So we worked together. I hired her to help me, and she knows how to tell a story. And she said, the only difference with yours is true. It's not different than what I do. So we rewrote the book and the next 9 months, and it was painful. But it was also another layer of recovery and healing from some of the issues that I had gone through when I was in Afghanistan. And she pulled things out and said, no, you can't have that. She said, put more in about this. Tell me more of that with action. She told me all kinds of things about writing I didn't know. And we came out with these lessons at the end of each chapter. And so it turned into what I was very pleased and felt would be helpful, because she said, why would anyone want to buy your book if they don't care about Afghanistan or care about a school? You need to give value to the readers. So at the end of each chapter is the Unveiled Truth, which is the lessons I learned, which reflective questions, so that the reader can then think about their own life and how they, may have had a boss that didn't appreciate them, or cultural issues or marital issues, and then can be used in a book group or individual study. So anyway, that came out the end of 2019.
Gail, can you just wrap things up for us? Do you have some parting words that you would like to leave our audience with today regarding how we can be a good Christian neighbor?
Well, one of the lessons I have in there is about culture. And I think what I learned from that is that it really slams into your world at times. You meet people that don't line up. You meet people that push ahead of you, and just the things that can happen that really rub against you and irritate you. But I feel like if we close off our opportunities for experiencing new things with new people, like it's coming into our diverse country at this time, we really miss out on some excellent opportunities to learn about the bigger world that God has made, our place in it, and how I really think, I don't know about you, but as one who's lived overseas, we're in historic times. There are people who are now coming up against Christians for the first time in their life because they had to pop out of Syria or Iran or Afghanistan, where they never had that opportunity. And so I feel like if people would just open their eyes and ask this question we've said, what's in my path, God? What is in front of me that I can do? He will make it clear and show you it's not as hard as you might think it would be. But to close ourselves off, or sometimes even, I love people that give money to help Afghan refugees, but they don't want to meet one. And I think, well, that's helpful and God will use it, but really jump in. The water's fine. I mean, it's not going to undo your life or cause you any kind of danger. And I feel like that's what the loving your neighbor is, to be that Samaritan. It's in your path. What could I do? I don't feel like that man who helped the Samaritan was put out. If he didn't lose his job, he didn't lose his fortune. He helped someone and left that testimony of that compassion in his heart. So that's probably what I would say is don't be afraid. Headscarves are not a sign of anything jihadist any more than a face mask makes us some kind of person who wants to rob you or be in, that kind of danger. I think we need to just know there's people behind those coverings and go ahead and invite them into your life in a small or big way.
I love that. There are people behind those coverings. Absolutely. Regardless of the differences that we have in our physical appearance, and some as superficial as clothing, and skin color, and those just very surface things, we are all people. And I love that you had said just to interact on a human level. I think most people are also very, very open for questions and things like that. Don't be afraid. Jump in, the water's fine. I love that. Thank you so much, Gail. And thank you for being on Radical Abundance today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was fun to share our collective experiences and know that there are many people out there who will make great new friends that you never thought about before, but it would be an enriching experience.
Indeed. And I wish you a radically abundant day.